Welcome to Session 3B, Using Trends to Make Informed Instructional Decisions. In Session 3A, you prepared information about student performance by using the rubrics to identify trends. You'll now use these trends to inform targeted next instructional steps. In this video, you'll identify instructional moves based on trends in student performance. We'll then plan how to implement these instructional moves so they really address the trends you're seeing and support all students toward the targeted outcomes. Note that up until this point, we've always used trends in student data to consider what we might need to change about the assessment. This is what led to all of the wonderful revisions you made to your assessment in Course 3. Now we're making the assumption that we've revised the assessment to a point that we can instead think about reasons for the trends that are related to instruction. This will allow us to think about how we can tailor instruction to address students' needs. To make informed instructional decisions, we take 3 steps. First, we review the trends we've identified and try to determine what are some potential reasons the students are performing this way in the assessment. We then consider our original intentions for the assessment to identify learning outcomes we want to focus on to address the students' needs we see. And lastly, we use those reasons for the trends and learning outcomes to plan instructional decisions that are really aligned with where we want to move our students. Like in Session 3A, we'll model these steps with a DEAR task, occasionally asking you to pause throughout to think and practice with this example. At the end of this video, you'll then have an opportunity to do this whole sequence with your student work. If we want to make informed instructional decisions, we first need to figure out why we might be seeing the trends we're seeing. First, we review our trends and what most students need that we decided in the last session. And to help us organize our planning, we can add these trends to the left-hand column of our planning table. And this helps us clearly see how the instructional decisions we make are aligned to the trends we saw in student work. In the next few slides, we'll brainstorm a few possible reasons for each of these trends, and then you'll decide which is more likely based on the patterns that were revealed using the rubric. This is where we want to get creative and think about what the possible reasons are for the trends we saw in the student work. For our trend we saw with the SEP, why were most students able to describe relevant patterns from each of the figures in Question 3, but they aren't citing the relevant figures to support their claim in Question 4? Well, think about what might have happened in prior instruction that prepared students to analyze data in Question 3, but didn't adequately prepare them to describe the data to support their claim in Question 4. Similarly, for the DCI, we also want to think about why most students' reasoning wasn't describing how changes in living and non-living parts of the ecosystem explain the patterns seen in the figures in both Question 3 and Question 4. What made it difficult for students to show evidence of the DCI across the questions? When we analyzed the instruction prior to the DEAR task, we noted that students did get plenty of practice analyzing and interpreting different data sources, particularly graphs. We also found that during these lessons, students were most often using a graphic organizer to help them analyze and organize the data. However, we also noticed that students were only occasionally asked to use data to support a claim, and when they weren't asked to connect different data sources together to support their explanation. For the DCI, we wondered whether the experiences students had with how living and non-living parts of the ecosystems interact were perhaps not sufficient for them to apply that understanding in this task. We also discovered that they were never provided with explicit examples of competition between species, which is one element of the DCI. Similar to the last dimension, students didn't have enough experience integrating the dimensions, meaning they were not often asked to connect their content knowledge to explain the data they were seeing. So here we'll consider which of these possible reasons is most likely based on the trends we're seeing in the assessment. In your DEAR task practice document, bold one reason per trend to indicate what you think is the most likely reason for each trend. Pause now. Based on the trends, we thought this seemed like the most likely reason. The fact that students were able to describe relevant patterns when it was individual figures, or they had the help of a graphic organizer, tells us they most likely had enough practice with analyzing and interpreting data. It's the ability to connect those patterns in a way that supports the claim that students are struggling with in question 4. And based on the fact we know students had a fair amount of exposure to interactions within ecosystems, it seems likely that students are struggling to make sense of the competition between elk and deer because they haven't been exposed to that concept in prior instruction. This may, of course, be linked to issues of integrating dimensions because students don't have the content knowledge to connect to the data they're seeing. We highlight the most likely reason in our instructional moves planning table because identifying these reasons will help guide our decisions on what instructional move will be most successful in addressing these trends. Now that we've identified the likely reason for the trend, step 2 is to identify the learning outcomes we'll focus on to address these trends and move students toward where we want them to be. When trying to identify learning outcomes to focus on in the next instructional steps, we often find it helpful to start with the rubric descriptions we wrote for these questions. While these descriptions are specific to the DEAR task, they do give us some information about the types of knowledge and skills we hope to develop in our students to help them progress. So we look at the description of performance for the SEP from both question 3 and question 4, and we look at what they have in common. For example, as you see highlighted in yellow, both of these questions were measuring students describing patterns from the figures. We also think it's very important for this SEP that students are using these patterns from the figures to provide sufficient evidence for a claim. So we highlighted that in orange as well. We then pull these ideas together and make sure that the language is general enough to apply to any instructional activity, regardless of the phenomenon. In this case, describe patterns from relevant pieces of data to provide sufficient evidence for a claim. Here we'll practice drafting a general learning outcome for the DCI. To get you started, we've pasted the description of performance for the DCI for question 3 and question 4 into the table in your DEAR task practice document. Feel free to delete these once you finish drafting your learning outcome. Pause now to move to your DEAR task practice document. I'm sure you also notice that there's a lot going on in these descriptions of performance for the DCI. Both ask students to provide reasoning, use patterns in data, and describe how the interaction of living and non-living things in an ecosystem affect a population. We took all these pieces and combined them into one learning outcome. Provide reasoning to describe how interactions between living and non-living things in an ecosystem can affect a population, as indicated by patterns in data. With clear reasons for the trends we're seeing and clear outcomes to move students forward, we're ready to start planning next instructional steps. To frame our planning, we not only want to consider instructional moves that meet the learning outcomes we just identified, we also want to make sure we address the primary reasons for these trends to help us design really targeted next steps. For example, we decided that students don't have explicit exposure to the idea of competition between species in instruction prior to the assessment. So we want to make sure we choose at least one instructional move that actually exposes students to this idea. We'll describe 3 different kinds of instructional moves, walking you through examples of each, using trends from the DEAR task and providing some guidance for when you might leverage each different type. Throughout this video, keep in mind that while we'll end up selecting one instructional move as an example, you'll often choose to use multiple in your own practice. If you're seeing a lot of students struggling to apply the same dimensions in their response, or if the reasons for your trends are highly specific to the ways students use the dimensions together in a question, you might consider using this instructional move, doing an analysis of a sample response from that task they just took. This move is particularly helpful when students haven't quite developed enough proficiency to be ready to apply their understanding to a new context. This kind of move falls well within students' zone of proximal development because they have a foundation to build from and you've already identified what they're just about ready to do next. You might choose to pair this with an opportunity for students to revise their own assessment using what they've learned from this instructional activity. Here's an example of what this instructional move can look like for the DEAR task to really illustrate the differences between the evidence we're looking for and the trends we actually saw in student responses. We have students compare two sample student responses to question 4. As they analyze, we ask them to annotate the examples using the instructions you see on the slide and pick one response that supports the claim better than the other and explain why. Pause the video here to analyze this instructional move. How does it address the reasons for the trends that we identified? Hopefully you notice that the prompts for this activity are very specifically designed to target the SEP and DCI that we're working on. These prompts specifically ask students to connect two pieces of data, since that addresses the reason for the trend in the SEP that we identified. And you'll also notice that students are explicitly asked to point out where they see competition between species, since this was also identified as a reason for the trend in the DCI. The second kind of instructional move we're suggesting is a learning activity that focuses on the same dimensions we targeted in the assessment, but that brings in a new context or phenomenon. If you notice that students are beginning to use the dimensions but just need more practice and support, you might consider this kind of instructional move. It provides students with supportive opportunities to both monitor and develop their proficiency with the dimensions, which builds confidence and science literacy. It's a good option if you see that students are really fatigued with the assessment context and really want to move on to something new. While teachers often find that they need to balance the time it takes to incorporate an additional activity, depending on the depth of needs and what you're trying to address, this doesn't necessarily need to be a full classroom activity and can just be a warm-up activity or an exit ticket. Here's an example of what this move can look like if we use it to follow up on the DEAR task. Here, students are expected to connect multiple pieces of data to support a claim for why the native mussel population is declining in the Hudson River. Through their data analysis, students find out that zebra mussels introduced into the Hudson River are competing with the native mussels, and this is causing a cascade of effects within the ecosystem. As you can see by the highlighting, this learning activity hits all of our targeted outcomes and addresses each of the reasons for trends by giving students an opportunity to connect multiple pieces of data and see another example of competition. And finally, you might consider planning a learning activity in your next unit that targets some of the same dimensions but uses topics relevant to the next unit. Use this move when you feel like there are ways you can target at least some of the same dimensions in the next unit or subsequent units. This often means asking students to apply the cross-cutting concept or SEP with a new DCI and phenomenon. Regardless of whether you implement the prior two kinds of instructional moves, this is a really great move to utilize because it often doesn't take up any extra instructional time, and it usually strengthens the next unit since instructional planning will explicitly take your students' need into account. So let's return to our DEAR task example. For the next unit after the DEAR task, students are doing an integrated chemistry unit. One of the performance expectations in this unit is about analyzing and interpreting data to determine whether a chemical reaction has occurred. This PE provides similar opportunities as the DEAR task in that students will need to support a claim by using reasoning about the DCI to connect multiple pieces of data. If we want to make sure this learning activity addresses the trends we saw in the DEAR task, then we need to make sure the way we prompt students in this activity is similar to the way we prompted students in the DEAR task. For example, while we can't address the competition between species aspect of our trend from the DCI, we can ask students to use reasoning about this particular chemical reaction's DCI to explain the patterns they see in the data and use it to support a claim. Since students needed significant support in using the DCI to support their reasoning in the DEAR task, we decided these trends indicate that students could benefit particularly from an activity where they use that DCI again and where the teacher provides very explicit attention during the activity to supporting how students use the data and how they use ideas related to competition between species to support a claim. This option requires the most time, but we thought it was worthwhile because so many of our students were demonstrating this trend. Note that in this case, the instructional move we decided on addresses both the trends in the SEP and the DCI. Sometimes you'll plan different instructional moves for each trend. We also want to emphasize that any of these instructional next steps are a good option. If there wasn't time to introduce a new activity, any of the other options could be used to address the trends based on your goals and constraints. When you embark on this process with your own assessment, you'll want to pick the instructional move or moves that best work for you and your goals for your students. Once we identify what kind of instructional move works best to address the trends we see in a way that works for our students, we need to be very intentional about planning this activity so it allows all of our students to reach the desired learning outcomes. Now you'll consider these questions in relation to the DEAR task. When do you think you would implement the zebra mussels activity? Immediately after the assessment or strategically placed within the next unit? Who would you implement the zebra mussels activity with? A whole group or strategic small groups or an individual student? How would you scaffold it to make sure all students are able to meet the targeted outcome? Pause here to consider these questions. Because so many of our students struggled with the SEP and the DCI and the DEAR task, we decided it would be beneficial to first go through the cycle of feedback and revision, in which we provide whole class feedback that emphasizes these trends and gives students an opportunity to revise accordingly. Then they'd be ready to apply what they learned with the new phenomenon with the zebra mussels. Also keep in mind that you might consider incorporating multiple instructional moves. So the next unit, you might include a targeted learning activity, such as the rusted bike chain activity, to target the SEP trend again. Making sure our instructional moves are successful requires more nuanced planning. So we fleshed this out in a separate table below our original planning table called Planning Instructional Moves. Next, we'll use our data to consider which students to implement this activity with. Because a large percentage of our students showed these trends, we'd implement this learning activity with the whole class. But it's worth considering different pairing options throughout the activity. For example, you might have students analyze the graphs in pairs, then write their final explanations individually. You might even use your analysis of student work at the dimension level to help you pair students strategically, so that will further support their learning. But what about our students who are struggling with the same trends with the DCI and SEP, but are needing even more support to get to the kind of responses we see in 75% of the class? Recall these three examples of some of our emerging responses from question 4 in the DEAR task. We're seeing a few different issues at the emerging level. Student 1 makes a claim that's irrelevant to the data. Student 2 is attempting to describe data source 5, but isn't relating the data to a claim. And student 3 is making a relevant claim, but there's no support provided. For your group of emerging students that are showing a different set of needs like these, how would you scaffold the zebra mussels learning activity to make sure this group of students is able to progress as well? Pause the video here to consider what kind of scaffolds would help this group of students access this activity. There are lots of different ways you can further scaffold this activity for your emerging students. One specific thing we noticed in our emerging students is that they were having trouble analyzing the graphs and connecting the data to the claim. To support this need, we could provide a graphic organizer like the one you see here that has the steps for data analysis chunked out. We can not only provide guiding questions to help them analyze each individual graph, but we can also use arrows and connecting questions to encourage them to connect their data analysis between the graphs. You could provide this as an optional scaffold to all your students or just for your emerging students, depending on your students' needs. As you monitor students' work during this activity, you'll know if more support is needed, such as pulling a strategic group for guided practice. We also recommend checking in with students after they fill in this graphic organizer. Keeping your outcomes in mind and providing in real-time feedback based on these targeted outcomes will help learning progress toward our goal of three-dimensionality. In addition, for students who need language support, providing sentence frames for each component of the culminating question can be immensely helpful. These can be displayed in the class, modeled, practiced, or pointed out when the students use any related science language during the activity. And you can even consider using these as discussion sentence frames for students to first orally discuss the culminating question before writing individually. At this stage, you can see that we've started a solid outline of a plan of next instructional moves. Fully planning out this activity, especially developing certain scaffolds, will take some time. However, once developed, like the sentence frames for an explanation, you'll be able to use them repeatedly in different contexts. Now it's your turn to plan instructional decisions based on the trends you identified in the previous part of session 3. Once you complete the planning of your instructional decisions, you can move on to the next video, session 3C, using trends to provide feedback to students.